for joining this session on program governance. I'm going to try and take an admittedly dry topic and make it not quite as dry, hopefully. We'll see how it goes. So the tagline for this was making HR operations more efficient with informed decision making. And you'll notice that the emphasis isn't so much on automation necessarily, so much as overall program governance, of which, the automation, that may be the part that you're focused on, or it may be broader than that, but we'll get into that as we go through. So let's talk a little bit about what the flow of this will be, and then we'll get into it. So I'm going to give you an overview of Bridgestone. And for those of you who are paying real close attention, you may notice that Bridgestone is not the company that I currently work for, but it was the last role that I was in where program governance was my primary domain. And it also represents the best case study that I'm allowed to talk about pretty openly. Obviously, I have to keep things a little bit closer with the company that I'm with now. So I'll give you an overview of the company, talk to you about the journey to success, dive into the specific case study a little bit, and then go back over the learnings and takeaways. I'm going to try and cover those as we go through, but also want to have that called out at the end. So Bridgestone Americas is a subsidiary of the overall Bridgestone Corporation, which is headquartered in Japan. And it's the largest manufacturer of tires in the world after Lego. Lego actually produces the most tires, and the most tires in terms of volume of units, but in terms of ones that go on your car and people can actually use to do things with, Bridgestone is the number one. About 45,000 employees, obviously pre-pandemic, and then 150,000 of us for the overall Bridgestone Corporation. That 45,000 is just for the Americas. 16 billion in revenue, which makes up about half of the total 32 billion Bridgestone Corporation revenue. 83% of that is from tires. You may, okay, what's the rest of it? It is made up of industrial and building products. So think of one of the things is air springs for Teslas and some semis. And insulation for industrial roofing is another product. So about 17% of the revenue comes from other products like that. Also, 2,200 vehicle centers, that's where you would go to get your tires changed or get an oil change or something like that. 53 different plants making all kinds of different things, component parts, final parts, and then obviously tires. And then 14 major offices. There's a shared service center in Nashville. There used to be one in Antioch, but that has been closed as a result of the pandemic, and those jobs are being consolidated in the Nashville office. One in Akron, Ohio, and then another one in Costa Rica. So the situation with Bridgestone. Bridgestone is obviously a very old company, and so has a lot of operational debt. These are things that tend to happen at companies and obviously become more of an issue the older a company is and the larger that it grows. You make a decision at some point because you need to, and what you realize down the road is that obviously there are trade-offs in all of those decisions, and you've given up something to get what it is that you're making that decision for. And all that kind of collects in operational debt similar to technical debt. So about 70% of transactions are processed by business HR and COEs. So think about this, instead of being employee self-service or manager self-service or even centralized service center, 70% of those transactions, or even within the HCMS or distributed systems, these are being done by business partners and COE staff. Only about 20% of that was shared services, which then obviously tells you only 10% of that was done either through employee or manager self-service or kind of the handshake partner to that within the HCMS. 30% of HR activities completed by non-HR staff. So going outside of just that small view in the world, you're talking about, okay, non-HR staff who are doing all of these HR activities. 30% of the HR work that was done at least one level below role. So, going back to HR business partners who should be doing strategic planning for their partner organizational units are instead doing things like promotion transfers and pay changes and things like that, helping those forms get processed. 47% of HR processes not standardized. Obviously, we run into big problems there, problems in terms of efficiency, liability, employee experience, lots of different problems that you'll run into there. It took 1.5 hours to do a headcount report for a single location. So we're not talking about the enterprise. We're talking about, all right, if you wanted to get really sure on how many people worked at the service center in Akron, Ohio, it would take about 1.5 hours just to do that headcount report. And there was still, I would say, a degree of maybe that was going into that. It wasn't a sure thing. And then 90 different system instances of HR software, right? So you think about all across the company, be it separate instances within the same software platform or different software platforms, there are 90 different HR system entities that were out there living and breathing and kind of doing their thing. About 1,400 policy documents. This is one of my favorites. 130,000 open positions, which again, for a company of 45,000 people, y'all are pretty good at math. And obviously we weren't running with that many open positions because you can't. And then this one, an estimated $8.4 to $83.9 million in risk, just from legal liabilities in places or just outstanding payments in some cases. So where do I fit into that mix? My role was as the program manager for service delivery. We'll talk a little bit about what that means, but it was primarily focusing on the shared services space within HR at Bridgestone. I was really focused on overall org effectiveness, budget management within the program, and then program management. We didn't have dedicated project managers. So instead of program manager in the sense of project management integration, a lot of it was really focused around, okay, how do we get these disparate groups of people who in some cases are working in line in a hierarchy with each other, and in some cases are in more potentially antagonistic relationships. How do we get them to make informed decisions together that will stick and hold and can be efficient both in terms of the immediate decision-making process, but then the long-term holding process in terms of how that flows out. Governance operations for both implementations and process improvements. So implementations in terms of new, smaller software deployments, things like that, data integration changes, and then also process improvements in terms of the processes themselves. And really, a lot of this had to do with an emphasis on culture. Going back to the project management about how people make decisions. Yes, there are functional things that we did. There were changes that we could make, but a lot of this just had to do with stopping the, okay, you go into a room, you have a conversation, everyone says, are we aligned on this? Nobody disagrees. And then you walk out of the room and 4 different people come up to you and say, I can't believe this is what we're doing. There are so many problems with this. So changing that culture of bringing the conversations into the room, getting everybody on the same page, getting them to feel good about those decisions and making them stick. So where did that me in that role fit within Bridgestone Americas? So this is just a quick org chart. You can see Bridgestone Americas. They're the business units, which are the technical portions, I guess you would say, running the different things. So making the building products, selling them, making the tires, selling the tires, running the service centers, so on and so forth. And then you obviously have your corporate functions as a partner to that. Under corporate functions, HR, no great surprise, with business HR on one side and the COEs on the other. And then under the COEs, you can see your standard COEs that you think of, and then service delivery, which is the one I was mentioning earlier, which is a combination of what you would see in an ongoing shared services organization, as well as the HR infrastructure initiative to implement a new HCMS and handle a lot of that operational debt within HR that had accrued. So the timeline, where does this fall in terms of everything happening? The project had started in 2016. My portion of it really covers 2018 through some of 2019, and then the system go-lives were planned for 2020. So what were the big wins that we saw? And again, this is before your main new HCMS go live. What were the wins that we saw within the program development, the process improvement within that infrastructure initiative before we had truly our main goal come to fruition? So we released about 42,000 annualized hours of capacity. So that was work that was previously being done that no longer had to be done for various reasons. And we'll go through that a little bit later in terms of what the different reasons were for that release. But that was work, that 42,000 hours of work that would have had to have been done that no longer needed to be done. So not just shifting, but actual removal of that work. We released that capacity. We reduced the systems incident rate by 88%. So, think of breakages within your ATS, within your payroll system. We saw those go down by 88%. We improved the project completion rate from 22% to 92%. We reduced the time for governance decisions by 60%. So think about this, a lot of these governance decisions would end up with the HR executive team, your CHRO, and then your heads of COEs. And so when you're thinking about reducing the amount of time that it takes for them to reach a decision, as well as feeling better about the decision and coming back to that less often, that's a real gain. And I think that's what I want you to hold in mind, particularly as we talked about the fact that we actually added more formal practices in place and brought more people into the governance process, but ended up reducing the total time, even with that consideration for bringing more people in and adding more structures around that. We came in 15% under budget, and that ended up with a $5 million reduction in the 2020 budget versus the expectation, the budgeted versus actual. And then we're on target to deliver the new HCM and case management by May. That obviously was delayed a little bit with the pandemic, but that was the target that we had at the time. So what were some of the projects that we did? We did RFP and selection and began the implementation for a new HCMS and a new case management system. We did optimization of payroll, at least part of it. That was also going to be a multi-phase project, but there were portions of that got done in preparation for the new systems. We integrated the current ATS with the current HCMS, right? So this isn't the new one, but the existing ATS and HCMS did not directly talk to each other, and so created an integration for that. Migrated to one updated hourly clock system. So thinking back to that 90 different instances of HR software, that included clock systems, which ran all the way from some of your big players like Kronos down to sites who were managing hours within an Excel sheet. Centralized LOA, tuition reimbursement, service awards, unemployment, people data and reporting, bonus administration, and end of employment. So just a number of different processes and transactions that we took from being out in the field, either with field HR or hiring managers in some cases, or just borrowed staff, say an office admin, and brought that into centralized HR folks. Initiated one-to-one position management. Anybody who's gone through this or like been in a company that didn't have position management and then moved to a company that had position management, this is by far one of the sleeper hits of it. If you've always had it or never had it, you don't really understand how big of a difference it can make. But thinking back to that 130,000 open positions, right? That controls it, because you've got then your organizational plan, and you have to hire within that organizational plan or get a formal approval for going outside of that. And then going along with that was initiating a headcount control procedure. So what was the key learning as we look over what were the things that we accomplished here, right? And I alluded to this earlier, automation was not the goal, right? And not sure about all of you and where you are. You may be coming in here solely focused on an automation program, right? But that's not the goal. And even if you're just working on an automation program, not as a part of an overall process improvement campaign or operation or kind of transformation effort like this, automation isn't truly the goal, right? It's what you're going to get out of that automation. So more accurate processes that happen faster and are done with as little human intervention as possible, right? So truly thinking about that effectiveness and efficiency that can be brought through that. But automation for the sake of itself is not the goal, right? So if you think if you were automating, right, but it was going to be a less accurate process that was slower and took more people contributing to it, right, that would not truly be, it might be automation, but you haven't really accomplished the thing that you set out towards. So I think that's the first key learning, and probably one of the biggest ones, is automation is not your goal. Even if you think it is, it's not truly automation. It's these other things that you want to get out of it. So let's take a look at how that broke down for us at Bridgestone. So here were where we got the big wins, right? These were the different areas where we saw work improvements that I mentioned earlier with all those big wins, right? So one was centralization, and that was about 35% of the gains that we saw were just because of centralization. So, as you move from distributed staff into a core staff, they do those things more often and are therefore more efficient at them. Now, if you hire people, right, especially if you hire people occasionally, you've felt this. You go to open a requisition, it's been 6 months since you've done it the last time. That's going to be slower than it may be for somebody who does those pretty frequently to go in and do that. So that's where a lot of it came in with centralization. Also just fewer waits, right? So, fewer times where you're waiting for somebody somewhere else to do something. And then obviously you can have tighter controls on that as well. So about 17% came from outsourcing. A lot of that had to do with benefits administration, but there were a couple other places as well. Foreign language services and call center overflow were some of the primary ones. Standardization. So this one really goes in concert with centralization, but it also is distinct. I want to make sure that they are called out separately, even though they do so often go together, right? You can centralize things, but not standardize them. And so you can have a staff who are dedicated to certain transactions. So it's not out in the field anymore. It's not people who are doing lots of different things, but no standardization among them. And so they're not doing things the same way, right? Or vice versa, although that's a lot harder to do. And you're probably not hanging out for this if that's where you are, if that's what you're trying to do. So that reduces our system instances, reduces our complexity, formalizes the process, and allows us to do a lot of different things that we couldn't do before, because we can set them to a policy. We can set that process to a policy and then execute against it. And then you have your optimized bucket, and this brings in the automation, right? So automation, again, it was a great thing, got a lot of value in it, but it wasn't our primary driver. It ended up being about 21% of the improvements, right? So some of that was RPA, also taking advantage of in-system capabilities that we hadn't really used before. So workflows within the ATS, things that you could do within SharePoint and some low and no code systems. The integration between the ATS and the HCMS, for instance, file feeds and integrations. And then in some cases, just more robust tools. In some cases, even simple budget visualization, right? And then simplification. Right, so this is the one, we only saw about 15% of the actual gains there, but in the end, this is the one that's going to be your biggest or most serious wins, in the sense of the work just goes away, right? So simplification is about completely eliminating the work, not bringing it into a central team, not doing the outsourcing, not necessarily putting it into a robot to do it, but saying, do we actually need to do this thing? Do we need to collect all these fields? Does someone need to go through this process? Do we need 7 policies to cover the different areas of the business, or can we have one policy that covers everybody? So simplification didn't necessarily make up the biggest percentage, but if you think about what truly has the longest impact in terms of that work, simplification is always going to be your biggest and best bet. So what were the key principles that we took into this governance process that allowed us to do all these things, and as we were making these decisions about how to go forward with those initiatives? So the first was following a strict governance process, right? And strict is in quotations there, because I don't mean following our governance process strictly. And I don't even mean following your governance process strictly. I mean following the governance process that you have at the time strictly. So think of some of the debate going on in the Senate right now about the Senate's rules. The Senate's rules are whatever they say they are. So if you need different rules for the governance process, as long as your governance process has a way of dealing with that, that's great. That's what it's there for. Focus on a few things. So this is one that it's really difficult to overstate. One of the ways that we worked on improving our project success rate was by taking the amount of in-flight projects from over 100 down to under 30, right? Focusing on a few things and doing that within appropriate bounds for the different organizational layers, but getting people to focus on a few things, right? So think about your maximum work in progress. A really simple exercise that you can do this is set out a stopwatch and time yourself writing the alphabet. See how long it takes you to write the full alphabet, right? And then restart the stopwatch and see how long it takes you to number from 1 to 26, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And then time how long it takes you to do both, switching back and forth. So A1, B2, C3. Even that simple exercise will show you how divided attention can lower your overall productivity. And then everyone was going to be engaged, right? So this meant different things to different people, but everyone within the service delivery organization was going to get their Six Sigma white belt. All the leaders and identified SMEs would be yellow belt trained. We brought in people from outside of the HR process to help enable leaps and bounds, right? So this was about breaking down the silos of, if we're working on something that primarily impacts the retail business with those service centers, let's get them involved in that, or with benefits, for instance. And then having focused jobs to drive behavior forward. So moving towards having a specific project manager for the HCMS implementation, having a specific continuous improvement manager who could be focused on maintenance of the ongoing programs to be ensured that we were building in this culture of continuous improvement. So really the key learning from all these things, and it goes with the first bullet point up there about following a strict governance process, is have a process, right? I'm going to talk with you about what our process was, but again, I don't want you to just write this down word for word and say, oh, if we do that, we will be successful. The important thing here is not the specific process that we followed, but we had a process that we followed and we knew why we used that process. So here's how our process played out. An idea would be identified. This could be somebody coming to us and requesting it. This could be somebody from one of the frontline teams saying, hey, I see an opportunity for improvement, or it could be taken from the existing backlog. We had a rule that if that sat solely within a single team and wouldn't affect any of the other deadlines, then it was completely up to them as to what the prioritization was and how to pursue it. But if not, then it would go into this review structure, right? So think about if somebody on the analytics team wanted to improve a dashboard, as long as they felt confident that that wouldn't impact work that they were doing in another area, they could go do that to their heart's content, obviously with their manager's approval. In terms of the review structure, so as the program manager, I was the first line of defense. And really the things that I was looking for was, the first question is this ours to own? Is this something that belongs to service delivery in terms of an ongoing ownership, or within the infrastructure initiative in terms of the change implementation? And then if so, is it more important than what we're already doing, given its effort and the predicted improvement, right? That was one that sometimes there was a lot of subjectivity to making that assessment, but that was the kind of thing that I was looking for. And then who should be, if the answers to those questions weren't clear, then I would try and figure out who would be involved in further clarifying this. So potentially going back out to an external partner or pursuing with different teams within the organization to say, how big of a difference do you think this would make? How much effort do you think it would take? So if it wasn't of ours, we made a record of the request, right? It may simply be that that was a result of the existing structure and that could change in the future, or our priorities might change. And then if it was, we added it to the backlog, which goes back to the first point of making sure that everything was captured and being worked through appropriately. So the next part of our process has to do with the way things would progress. We use gates that were based on DMAIC. So define, measure, analyze, improve, control. Very common within the process improvement realm, and particularly Lean Six Sigma. So who owned those gates? Your first line of ownership would be the project team. So the project team would have a decision that they needed to make, or they'd say, hey, we think we're ready to move on to the next gate. They would decide that as a project team, and then they would bring that to that next gray bar, which was the service delivery leadership team. So this was a group of owners within service delivery, myself as the program manager, our change and communications manager, the executive director of the department, the HRIS manager, and a couple other players who the project team would bring in and say, we need to make this decision, or we think we're ready to move to the next gate, and they would bring it to that group. Now, those people that I mentioned, they were the approving group. So in terms of things going forward, right, they were the ones who had to give their approval. But everyone who was in that meeting, which was a representative from every project, had the ability to object and say, I think there's a problem with that. We wanted the ability for people who were the closest to the work to be able to speak up if they felt that there was a need. So we differentiated those approving groups and objecting groups. And then if it passed from the HRSD leadership team, it would go to that HR executive team that I mentioned earlier, the CHRO, and then the VPs of the different COEs. So I'm going to quickly run through what the different gates were. So your define, discover gate, this is where you're approving the investigation of the concept and refining the opportunity. What is it we're trying to do, and how do we think we're going to be able to do that? Gate 2, which is measure. So this is trying to create a picture of the current state. How long is it taking to do something? How many software instances do we have? Who's doing this work, right? How could you measure what's happening currently? 3 is analyze. So this mainly applies if you're dealing with true hard operational data, but also can apply to other instances in terms of, okay, what's our gap analysis in terms of the different clock systems, right? That's still a measurement of your current state, and then analyzing, okay, here are the weaknesses with that. Here's how much we think we could get out of combining that in terms of more accurate payroll and so on and so forth. Improve. So this is the one where you're actually building the solution, right? And in some cases, this may be a whole project in its own with its own internal, more common project-driven gate structure because of an implementation. If you're running implementation of a new software, you don't want to say, oh, it's just all in this gate. There still may be subparts to that, but that was the overall control procedures. Now you're implementing or building the solution. Gate 4.5 was the go live. So this just had to do with explicitly calling out there's a difference between the day before you turn on the change and the day you turn on the change, and bringing some formality and structure to that process. And then gate 5 was control. And so that was monitoring how things had gone since the implementation, saying, did we achieve our objectives? And is there any additional work that needs to be done? So what are the key learnings here overall, right? Automation is not the goal, it's a tool to the goal, right? Remember, your goal is somewhere in that triangle of better accuracy, faster, and hopefully more efficient. Have a process, and then a process for your process. So this goes back to where I had strict in quotations, right? You can change your process. You will need to at some point. So go ahead and build into your process, okay, if we realize at some point there's a need to change our process, how are we going to handle that? Who's going to be involved in that decision? How often are we going to evaluate that? Because your process will not be perfect, and so you want a formal, meaningful way to go about making that decision as well. And then lastly, use it rigorously. So once you have that self-correcting process in place that has that option for looking back on itself and saying, how can we improve the overall structure of what we're doing, use that rigorously. And use it until you realize there's a need to change, and then go back through the process of how you change that. That really, I mean, in terms of trying to sum it up into just a few key points, if you follow these things and truly internalize, I'm not saying it'll get you all the way there. I'm not saying that you won't have bumps and bruises along the way. But these are the biggest things I think to take away in terms of forming where you're going and how you're going to get there in a way that brings everybody along and hopefully produces the least heartache possible. So thank you everybody for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.